Okay, number one, there are two types of wrist to wrist. So, those two types would be wrist to wrist here and here. That's the one type of wrist to wrist we're familiar with. And then perhaps less people are familiar with the second type of wrist to wrist, which is the wrist to wrist of how far your wrists are away from your own body. So you don't end up having this sort of thing happen to you. So that has to do with how far they are this way. So I want to have equally here, not like this, or whatever, I'll move them, okay? And so I want to have that, and then I want to have this wrist to wrist here, this wrist against this wrist. So it has to do with wrist to wrist on my opponent, and wrist to wrist for myself, even if I were just playing by myself. Next would be the one type of time that you don't want someone to have. And that one, by the way, going back to wrist again, if we look at the control he has here that I'm sliding by, that one he's perhaps trying to help in the teaching and let me slide by, I'm not sure why, but that's very important. So the same way here, you can't, this wrist to wrist, you can't have control with a forward test. I did Chisao with somebody who was doing forward energy here. But the forward energy in Chisao, when you're playing and in Luxao, is this way, with the bomb against the foot. It's not this way. You don't go that way, so you maintain wrist to wrist with that one, maintain wrist to wrist, your forward energy check here. So if you go that way, it invokes a response, and it's not really a forward energy check, because this is not a technique to push that way unless you have a creative reason. And when we look at the wrist to wrist itself, it's also particularly important, as we mentioned in Chinatown, to make sure that he doesn't roll this foot and leave it open to that. If it can slide, it's not wrist to wrist. It's not the wrist to wrist checking concept that gives value and integrity to the Kung Fu here. Or you may do it with this forward energy where it's close here, but even here he's unable to do it. I don't know if I can do it very well there either. But here I'm going to go here. I'm not going to allow this to slide. If it slides at all, it's no good. So there's less people perhaps able to do this, which should be normally done closer with the foot here, than more using the palm at the wrist here, which can be done from a little further away with no problem. Sorry about that. Here. So here he's using a little bit of palm forward for the wrist to wrist action. We're in the center there? I hope so. You don't let me go do the whole thing without being in the center. It's only on me. Harder. Okay, so there we go, here. Then the question was about what type of tan do you not want the opponent to have? Well, it's certainly not a flat tan because you want them to have that. Unless you prefer a challenge. The type of tan you want them not to have is this, a vertical tan. If they have a vertical tan, that means they've walked in on you. They just snuck in, maybe you're having a conversation, and they don't realize what's happening, perhaps, or you don't realize when that tan goes vertical, it's not necessarily that a technique has been executed on you that you're aware of. And now, from a vertical tan, he has no jut power. He can't jut me properly. From here, if my tan, I try to make a strike, he can jut me, or do another technique depending on what I do. But from here, he can only do bad Kung Fu. So you should step forward a hair too, so we keep in the frame. We're still in the frame. So here, you want to make sure, because otherwise here, he can only do lesser Kung Fu. So maybe the drunken master has him walking in on me and goes, oh, I use my elbow to short circuit your forearm. So walk in and go vertical. So perhaps you could do this, but you see, he's using some strength, and I'm really using strength to use this as a technique to bring my elbow in or to punch. It's not a question of I can respond and overcome you with force or some surprise element. Maybe I make a comment about your mother and you go into shock. So it's important not to let that vertical ton come in wherever it's coming from so that you can't do those strikes. Let's take a pause and then we'll remember the other questions.